Thank you very much for coming out in the wet this evening. So when I was looking at this lecture series, I see that kind of the aim is to address some of the 21st century challenges, and I suppose I'm quite biased, but I think that housing is one of those really big 21st century challenges. So I called this talk Healthy Housing, Who Cares? And I suppose really what I'm going to get to at the end of about 40 minutes is why you should care. So I'll give you some evidence and talk about kind of the evolution of how we became interested in housing in South Australia, what we look at internationally when we look at housing and health, and then I'll kind of end with a series of bits of evidence that we've been generating out of our program of research. So I'm particularly interested in the relationship between housing and health, so I'll be really focused on that as we go on. So let's begin with that today. So when I was preparing for this talk, I've always looked at kind of housing and health research in journals and data, and I think we kind of forget going back about South Australia and the way that we kind of emerged in terms of housing. And I put up some of, hopefully you can read some of the bits of it, but the thing I was really surprised about when you go back through the South Australian newspapers is there's this incredible concern about the condition of people's housing right back to the 1850s. And it wasn't about my housing or my children's housing and access to the home ownership market. It was really about looking after other people and making sure that everyone's got affordable rents, that, you know, there was a slum clearance process in the centre of Adelaide back then. And things, I suppose, kind of ramped up towards the 1930s. I encourage you, by the way, to go back and have a look at some of these articles. They're just incredible, and it's just letter to the editor after letter to the editor. But by about the 1930s, things had ramped up so that every week in the newspaper there was a letter to the editor saying you really have to address the fact that people can't afford to pay their rents, that they're living in houses which are just completely unhealthy. And so as a kind of a response to that, the South Australian government really led the way in establishing a housing trust in 1937. And the point of the housing trust at that time was to improve the living standards and provide homes to working families. So then we kind of roll forward to World War II, and everything kind of gets put on hold for a little while. But immediately after World War II, it's really become a national issue. And so they set up a federal inquiry into Australia's housing problems. And they proposed at the end of that every citizen of the Commonwealth is entitled to a good standard of house, and this should not depend on his economic position or the policy of the particular state in which he resides. So this kind of inquiry led to the formation of the first Commonwealth State Housing Agreement, on which all of our public housing was based in 1945. Anyway, I thought that's kind of a nice background to look back at South Australia, really kind of leading Australia's way in terms of healthy housing. It's probably clearer on that one if you have a look. So the thing that, if you flick forward to now, the thing that you notice is that the story's completely changed. Generally, when you read in the media, you're not reading about people worrying about other people's housing and people worrying about other people not being able to afford their rents and their housing condition. So really, Australia's become a nation of homeowners up to now. And I've just put together some data from all of the censuses going back basically to 1947. There was a bit of a gap with 1933, but really there's this massive rise in home ownership, and then we've got one of the highest rates of home ownership in the world, sitting, you know, just around about 70% for the whole time. And the bit in blue just shows you the proportion of households which are renting. So that went down in response, really, to often the very poor quality of private rental housing. And in red, I've just shown you the proportion of public housing, and that's effectively just to show you that it emerged. It was only first collected in 1954, really emerged by about 1947, and it peaked in the late sort of 60s, 70s, 80s, and it's basically on a decline about now. So I suppose those kind of two views of the way we used to look at housing and the way that we look at housing now probably set the scene really nicely for what I want to talk about today. Oh, I should tell you about, the other thing that I hadn't read out is by the last time we collected it effectively, on average Australian households had assets of $839,000, which is averaged across the whole population, which is actually much higher than I would have expected. But the important thing to say about that is the three biggest components of everyone's assets are on average, first of all, their home, which on average is about $530,000. A lot of that's fueled by the eastern states home ownership market, their superannuation, and the third one, I think, which is probably a surprise to many of you, is investment properties. So 21% of Australian households have an investment property on average, which means that many more people than you would expect are investing as landlords effectively. So I originally put just the large part of the slide up to say these are the stories that we get in the newspapers these days. It's about markets and assets. So where can you invest to get the best return on your investment dollar effectively? And you don't see so many of those earlier stories. But I put the story in on the right just today because this was released this week. The Salvation Army did this incredible report, which has had quite a lot of impact, which I suppose shocked many Australians because they found enormous proportions of the populations that they were dealing with were actually going without meals, going without fresh fruit and vegetables, not sending their kids on school excursions, all basically because they had to pay for the costs of their housing. And on average, among the almost 3,000 people involved in their study, on average among that population, families had about $18 a day left after they'd paid for their housing costs. So just to give you an idea of kind of the current state of housing problems that we've got at the moment, because that will influence what I talk about with the health outcomes. The first thing to say is affordability. Australia's got one of the most unaffordable housing markets in the world, and I think when people internationally do these studies, they always come out as Australia as the heavy hitter in terms of unaffordable housing markets. So on the best estimates that we've got at the moment, about 1.2 million households out of Australia's 7.7 million households are actually in unaffordable housing. So that's 1 in every 6. Effectively. The other thing to say is that unaffordable housing or housing unaffordability is an increasing problem. So I've just pulled out some data from between the last two censuses. So in 5 years, between the 2006 census and the 2011 census, both rents and mortgages on average went up by 50%. So that's a pretty massive increase in a relatively short period of time. And I've just put a little graph in there which shows the National Housing Supply Council, their modelling, which shows effectively the same thing but over a longer period of time. So housing affordability, one of the big drivers of unaffordability is actually housing shortage. So Australia's always had a slight shortage of housing, and that's increased a lot in recent years. So it's also predicted to worsen. So in 2010, the shortage was estimated at between 76,000 and 284,000, depending on what parameters they used to define it. But the thing to say is when they actually map it over time, you see that the shortage, the amount of populations going like this, and effectively the shortage is increasing that gap. So there's an increasing gap that's occurring over time. I just put in a little bit about homelessness because I think it's important to the way that we think about housing. I mean, it's, I suppose, the end point on the spectrum. But take into account that every night over 100,000 Australians are actually homeless. And many of those are people with other existing disadvantages. So that's kind of something to keep in mind. And the final point I put in, the other thing to say about homeless, so a recent longitudinal study in the International Journal of Epidemiology found that homeless people actually have a life expectancy of 12 years less than the population who aren't homeless. So there's a definite health impact as we're going along there. And I've just put the last point in about substandard housing. Australians never talk about substandard housing because we always have this kind of view of Australian housing as actually really very good. and no real housing problems across the whole population. But some work that we've been doing in the last couple of years estimates that about 1.1 million Australians are actually in housing that's very poor or derelict at the moment. That's kind of mirrored in this week in The Guardian. They were reporting in the UK that they think that about 16% of the UK's private rental market are actually physically unfit for habitation, effectively. So I've got a whole series of housing problems and just beginning to make the link with health. The first thing is that affordability is, there's lots of housing things that affect health, but the way that the Australian market is set up means that affordability is the big overarching one. If you can afford your house, you can afford to buy a house that's suitable to your needs, that puts you in a zone where you want to educate your kids, that meets the needs of your disability or age, for example. So affordability is kind of the overarching one. And the other thing to say is it's our biggest expenditure. So it's the thing that we spend the most on every week, but it's also the thing that we spend the most on over our lifetime. It's also the thing that we can then bundle up and give to our kids. So that makes a big difference to the kids as well. It's something we pay for before we pay for everything else. So everyone tends to pay for their mortgage or their rent before they pay for their food, their transport, their education. And that has big effects because it means very small differences in the amount that you pay for housing actually have very big effects on all of the other things that you need to do well. And I've just put the graph at the bottom is just to say that lower income people tend to get the double whammy of having firstly a smaller income, but secondly paying a larger proportion of what they've got for housing. So that just shows the income distribution from lowest to highest by the average proportion of household income that's spent on housing. And a lot of the work that we've been doing shows that housing problems, affordability problems are really completely unevenly distributed across Australia. So there's some winners and losers in housing, and children in single-parent households, for example, cop it on a lot of fronts. The piece of work that we did for Vic Health showed that children in single-parent households were 9 times more likely than children in two-parent households to be living in unaffordable housing, and that has obvious implications. So when I started, the image on the front was actually, because I can't use real people, was actually an image from the SBS show Housos, which I suppose, looking back, I was seeing if I could include some of it, but it's actually so awkwardly inappropriate, really. So the thing is that when we talk about numbers, I thought it might be valuable to put up some of these are case studies from real housing housing situations for people that we've interviewed over time, and it gives you an idea, first of all, that there are people with significant housing problems in South Australia, but also people don't just tend to have one problem; they tend to have 3 or 4 or 5 problems compounded on top of each other. It's also good to remind an audience like this that people do have actual housing problems, because I think, maybe a few of us in the room have lots of housing problems, and some of us in the room probably have an investment property or, watch the market in case there might be a good bargain coming up, effectively. Okay. So a lot of what I'll talk about today is based on a research collaboration that I've been undertaking with a woman by the name of Dr. Rebecca Bentley from the University of Melbourne. I mention it because she's an epidemiologist and effectively I'm a geographer and a housing researcher. And what we've done is gradually kind of built a program of research where we've been trying to chip away at what the relationship between housing and health really is. So what I'd like to talk about today is a little bit of the so what, why bother looking at the relationship between housing and health, and then move on to the kinds of evidence that we currently have, and then maybe think about, is there a better way to be thinking about the evidence, and is there a better way to be producing the evidence, And then for a bulk of the talk, I'll talk about some of the big findings, some of the contributions that hopefully we've made towards the literature. So the thing about housing and health research is it's in this real boom of interest at the moment. There's a whole lot of people working on it from a whole lot of different disciplines, whereas 5 years ago it was ignored by many of the disciplines. And I think what's happened is, first of all, multidisciplinary teams have been getting together and starting to think about how you put together answers to the problems. Also, we've got a whole lot more sophisticated in the methods that we can begin to use to approach the problems. So there's a lot of work being done on longitudinal analysis of big data sets, looking at whole populations and comparing national populations, which I think has been providing some real insight. So what I've done on this slide is really show you some of the best known parts of the evidence base internationally. There's connections between things like, damp and overcrowding and toxins and health outcomes. And there's a few things to notice about what I've got in this slide. The first thing is, because it's the existing, it kind of concentrates on, firstly, the easy to measure things. So they're the measurable parts of the housing relationship and the measurable parts of the health relationship. And so they're kind of the first cut, really, all of this information. And the other thing to say is that a lot of this is associational evidence. So this thing has been seen at the same time as this other thing. So not much of the evidence base today actually says this thing causes this thing. And in terms of policy outcomes, and some of us kind of are aware of this, in terms of policy implications, you can't actually make a policy which tries to intervene unless you know that something actually causes the thing, not that it's just seen in the presence of it, effectively. And just before I get into the evidence, I just want to say, just briefly, Australia is quite different to the international case for housing and health. So really, we have different things that seem to be important. I talked about affordability, and I'll go straight to the second. We tend to regard housing as a health-promoting resource accessed through income, because so much of what's important about housing in Australia seems to come down to housing affordability, effectively. The other thing to say is the great majority of Australians are in actually quite good quality housing. There's no housing that's hardly any housing that's more than 200 years old. We tend to be located, it hasn't come out too clearly on the slide, but we tend to be located in the more kind of climatically mild parts of Australia. So 85% of the population live within about 15 k's of the coast. But the final thing to say is that hidden within that majority in good housing, there are some groups who kind of get the double whammy of living in a country where we say there is no problem and actually having a housing problem as well. So the kinds of evidence that we're kind of working towards is, firstly, we want policy relevant evidence. We want evidence that can actually be used to guide some kinds of policy in the future. And we also want it to be not based on what we call n=1. So, for example, we looked a couple of years ago at a piece of policy, and when we actually tracked back the data that it had been based on, we think that it was based on, 17 women in Glasgow in 1968. And, sometimes those findings become truth and then they transfer along into policy and maybe that's wrong. So what we're trying to do is create policy relevant evidence that's, based on the Australian situation and looking specifically at key groups. We're aiming to produce evidence that's causal or inferring it. So we want to find out what it is about housing that actually causes health outcomes. And we, in the finest sense, can't actually prove cause, but we can get pretty close to it with some statistics. Okay, we want to start telling the story to non-housing people, which is one of the focuses that we've been working on. It's actually, when we first started, it was really, really hard to get anything with housing in it up into a health journal, because it was just so boring for some bizarre reason, when in fact it's the place that we live, it's the place that, you know, we spend most of our lives in, effectively. Whereas quite often health journals were much more interested in walkability as instead of housing, which always confused me. The final thing is to look beyond the averages. So we want to start looking at subpopulations, the groups that are hidden within the general population, and start telling those stories. This slide really tries to say, well, to kind of bring out what we're trying to think of in a policy sense. I think quite often what the way that we've looked at housing and health outcomes is to say, well, I don't know, I know if we change this thing about housing, we get this health outcome at the end, so that's good enough. But I think now we've been working towards what's on the bottom of the slide, is looking at all the kind of the interrelationships that happen in the middle. So often it isn't the thing that you change about housing that has the health outcome. Often it might be the thing that you change about employment in the middle that has a bigger health effect on the kind of housing related health income, so health outcome. So really what we're trying to do is look at the way that the pathways work in between, so that, you know, there might be a potential to pull other levers as well as housing or health. We have this beautiful large data set that we use in Australia, and often we'll take this overseas and people be incredibly jealous of the size and the magnificence of the Hilda data set. But basically what it does is it follows about 18,000 people, and we've got up to about wave 14 at the moment. So every year, 18,000 people, representative across Australia. It asks them interview questions and self-completion questionnaires, and then that goes into a data set. And the value of that for us, it means that we can begin to follow people over time and look for things which make them different, and take into account all the other things, or as much as we can, that are happening in their lives, to give us more of an idea of what the causes might be at the very end. The other thing to say is that, of course, Hilda isn't the answer to everything. So we're starting to work with new data sets and collect our own data sets. We have a large data set that we first collected from an ARC linkage project in 2008. And what that did was it looked at 1,700 South Australian low-income households and their health and their housing and their employment, their education, all of those things. And we were lucky enough to get funding to go back and follow those people 5 years later. So now we can look at what's changed in between and what the longer term housing and health effects might be. And we've got a third wave of that study funded for 2017. So we'll start to be able to look at very long-term effects in South Australia on low-income populations. We also often use qualitative data because, you know, it's very important to know at the population level what's happening and what the numbers are, but sometimes you really need to go in and find out why. So we always include a component that goes in and starts to ask people why. We're beginning to look at linked administrative data sets to be able to, in more detail, go and look at the individual populations that we're interested. And we're doing a lot of collaborative work with people working on longitudinal data in New Zealand and the UK at the moment. Okay, really this is just to say that we're not just using one methodology, we're actually borrowing from a whole lot, and most of the work we do is actually in collaboration with people with different toolboxes of skills effectively. So geographers and epidemiologists and econometricians, large longitudinal data sets, and our favourite method is fixed effects longitudinal regression models. Talk about that. Okay, now this is the more interesting stuff. So what I'll talk about now is just really 7 parts of the evidence base, 7 little bits that we've been chipping away, just to give you an idea of the types of evidence that we've been generating. And most of this work has been with Dr. Rebecca Bentley from the University of Melbourne, but in fact on every piece of evidence there's a large team, and I'll try and talk about that as we go along. So the first question is, does housing affordability influence mental health in Australia? And what we show on the left is kind of the associational, and it's just evidence that says if you've got lower mental health, you have much higher odds of being in unaffordable housing. And that's not that surprising. It also works in the reverse. So we showed in that study that being in unaffordable housing also increased your odds of having worse mental health effectively. What we then went on to do with colleagues from the University of Melbourne and also Harvard was look at trying to establish what the causal relationship might be. So what's the causal effect, or inferring cause, what do we think is the effect of moving into low, unaffordable housing? And first of all, we found for the total population, there's not really a significant effect of moving into unaffordable housing. But the really interesting part of this, and kind of quite policy relevant, is that there is an effect for low-income people. And that fits with the kind of definitions that we generally use about unaffordable housing. I'll talk about it later, but when policymakers, when the Productivity Commission, when different researchers around the world look at unaffordable housing, they classify as paying more than 30% of your income for housing and being in the lowest 40% of the income distribution. And the reason for that is that, especially in Australia, we kind of support home ownership. So we effectively, you can choose to pay too much for your housing if you're in the high income brackets. And it's kind of supported by the tax system as well. So you don't pay capital gains tax on your primary place of residence. So it's those people who don't have enough money who are paying too much for their housing where you get a lot of the health effects. So this was a really interesting finding, and in fact we expected to find a health effect across everyone, but to find it at that exact 40% level was really interesting. The other thing to say is, the other reason why this is important is in Australia, when they use housing interventions like the First Home Owners Grant, they tend to be completely untargeted. So they're not targeted towards the low-income population. They tend to be given to everyone. Now, you'll probably notice on that slide that I just finished that the effect sizes, I don't know if there's anyone who looks at that kind of data, but the effect sizes look relatively small. The first thing is to say, well, what this slide tries to do is put it in some kind of context. So we measured in that previous slide an effect size of about 2 points on the mental health component score of moving into unaffordable housing or housing stress. So when you put that against the effect of separating from your spouse, it's halfway between that and being fired or made redundant. So that just gives you, really that slide's just to give you an idea of kind of the scale of effect that we're looking at. This next slide is another way of trying to think about the scale of that effect. If you think about the spread of mental health scores, which they're designed to follow a natural curve, and really what we try and do is we say, okay, well if we were to move the mean score just 2 points, like we found in the scores, what would that do to the population of Australians who are actually in unaffordable housing? So just moving that score 2 points to the left means that you effectively tip, I think it's about 130,000 Australians over the line into kind of a diagnosable mental health condition. Now this one is so simple, and it's one of my favourite pieces of work. All that I'm showing on this graph is the average mental health scores for people in different tenure types. So we were interested in the question, does tenure influence mental health? Now you would assume from that, and I have to remind you, I suppose it's associational data. It says what's the mental health score on average of people in different tenure types. I think there's an assumption that there's some cause from being in the tenure of your mental health score, but in fact when we looked at people moving into and out of different tenure types, we show that it's completely compositional rather than causal, the effect or that difference effectively. And if you think about it, that's not really surprising, because you have to jump through some hoops, for example, to get into social housing. And one of those is actually having health problems, often mental health problems. You might be older, etc. So in the last two slides, I've been talking about the relationship between affordability and health, and then tenure and health. The piece of work I'm going to talk about in a minute says, okay, well, we kind of understand the relationship between both of those, but do you think that it might all be acting together? So we ask the question, does tenure modify the relationship between affordability and mental health? When we do this analysis, we actually show that the previous findings that we found are different for owners and renters. So that relationship between housing affordability and health outcomes is quite different for owners compared to renters. So when you enter unaffordable housing as a private renter, your mental health tends to worsen. If you enter unaffordable housing as a homeowner, it barely has an effect. Effectively. So effectively there's a protective power of home ownership really in this case. So I suppose in terms of interventions, this really points to the need to focus on private renters and low-income private renters for health impacts. And I think the next, So it's probably particularly interesting when you look at Australian government expenditure on housing. So the great proportion goes to homeowners, a smaller amount to investors, and the smallest amount actually goes to renters. So we're kind of in a topsy-turvy relationship. And when you do the same kind of analysis for employment rather than tenure, you show that employment is important as well for that affordability and mental health relationship. And I suppose I've just put this slide in to show that kind of, we're widening the things that we're considering, and that, things like tenure and employment are important within the relationship. It's not just between housing and health. Okay. We always thought that there was a dose-response relationship. So, and I suppose a few of us would probably think that the longer you spend in unaffordable housing, the worse it's going to be for your mental health. And in fact, so what this figure badly shows is that what we do is we compare outcomes for people who've been in affordable housing for 2 years with people who've been in affordable housing and then entered unaffordable housing for 1 year. And the third line is people who've been in affordable housing for 1 year and then 2 years of unaffordable housing. And then the next one's 3 and then 4. And then we've actually repeated this analysis just recently, taking it up to 9 years of data. So what we actually find from this analysis is there's barely any cumulative effect. People tend to have an immediate effect, and then they kind of develop a resilience. And the only other thing to say is that women tend to develop the resilience much more quickly, and but everyone kind of ends up coming back down. So we're at number 5. We've only got 2 more after this. So this is a new piece of analysis which I think begins to bring in place effectively. So we had the suspicion in trying to make the arguments to health people that actually housing affordability wasn't just important for housing affordability. Housing affordability was important because it was beginning to sort people across our cities into more advantaged or less advantaged areas. And so the idea was to test, okay, when people move out of unaffordable housing, are they moving to more advantaged parts of Australia or less advantaged parts of Australia? And we use the CEFA index, the ABS CEFA index. And it actually shows that people who move for affordability in the graph, they are being sorted effectively into less advantaged areas. And I suppose this has implications if you think that it's happening over whole populations and happening over time. So it's probably one of the things that we need to watch. The other things that seem to be aligned with moving to less advantaged areas, couple families and older people and students tend to move up, and people who are evicted and renters and lone parents and people with health problems tend to move down to less advantaged areas. And I suppose this has implications because it means that the people that really you should be protecting more tend to get less protection over time. And I put this in because this paper came out this week, and it really begins to question, okay, we look at affordability and we kind of take the measure on face value, but what if you were to think about people over time and think about affordability over time? Does that change the way that we measure it and what it means? And in fact, what we've done in this analysis is we've said the way that we measure affordability, remember I was saying before, we base it on the 30%, paying more than 30% for your income and being in the lowest 40% of the income distribution. Well, actually, when you look at people over a couple of years, the great majority kind of churn in and out just around that boundary, really, because they only have to change one of those two things to change their relative position effectively. And that changes their definition of being in affordable or unaffordable housing. So when we saw there was a lot of churn happening between people who are classified as in affordable housing versus people who are classified as in unaffordable housing, we started to look at what the characteristics of those populations were. So if we remove all of the people who churn up and down, we're left with a kind of a core group of people who are just in unaffordable housing, unaffordable housing, unaffordable housing all of the way. And I'll show you on the next slide. We show that they're quite different people. So about 11% of the people that we would normally classify as being in unaffordable housing are actually what we call stickers. They're not slipping up and down, they're stuck within unaffordable housing. And they have all of these key characteristics of disadvantage. The thing to say is, I think a lot of what we've been measuring as unaffordable housing, the group that we've been measuring as being in unaffordable housing, has been kind of diluted by the 89% who were kind of slipping in and out. And actually for this group, we get a much bigger effect over time. One kind of looking at this is quite new work. I think one of the things we're beginning to think is a lot of these people would have traditionally been public renters, and they're now private renters because we've gone from, for example, in South Australia, we had 18% of our housing stock was social housing back in the late 60s, and it's now about 4.5%. So a lot of these people would have normally been in a place where we could have intervened and helped, and now they're more dispersed within the private rental market and they're harder to target with interventions. So I just want to leave you with this final piece of analysis, which is all of the work I've been talking about so far really tries to pull out one little bit and look at a relationship, and then one little bit and look at a relationship. But what we've been kind of closing our eyes to is that actually housing is more than just affordability, and we've been controlling for a lot of things. What if you take housing as a bundle? So this piece of work tries to say, okay, what's the effect of the housing bundle on health outcomes? We would assume it would be much bigger. And so this piece of work develops what we call an index of housing insults. And it says, we find quite clearly, there's all these gradients in the health outcomes that we've been looking at. I've just put two up for you. But basically it says those with a higher level of housing problems, effectively, have lower mental health. And there's a classic gradient that you'd see there. And also, just to mess with you, this goes in the opposite direction. So this time up is bad. So it says people with more housing problems have a much higher likelihood of having diagnosed clinical depression. Okay. So So I suppose what we kind of come to, hopefully, with this kind of collection, I've given you an idea of kind of why we think housing is important for health outcomes. And our priorities at the moment are trying to make the so what case, and trying to make the so what case to everyone other than housing people effectively. So we're trying to make it to planners and to Treasury people, to put it into dollars effectively, and to health people. And we've been trying to build a body of evidence that steps beyond association towards causation, so that it's more effective for policy interventions. One of the last things I'd say is, I think we need to think of the winners and the losers in Australian housing, rather than kind of one great Australian dream, and it's good to challenge it all the time. And my focus, as I move on for the next 4 years in my future fellowship, is to look at how do we think about multiple housing problems? How do we kind of bundle that bundle together and think of the people, because people who tend to have one housing problem often don't have one housing problem. They've actually got 4 or 5 housing problems all at the same time. But I suppose, housing researchers like housing research because it's one of those things, it's a great big lever that we can pull. So it's just a case of kind of making the arguments for other people to start pulling the levers. So I think that's kind of the beauty of it. It's really amenable to policy impact. I'll be interested in your questions. Thank you.